Welcome back to Talk Tensors. If you're trying to keep up with the cutting edge in machine learning, especially how machines see and understand language, you're in the right place.
Yeah, definitely.
Today we're doing a deep dive into a pretty interesting paper. It's tackling how we can make image classification, guided by language, a bit smarter. The paper is called PARIC, Probabilistic Attention Regularization for Language-Guided Image Classification from Pre-trained Vision Language Models. Quite a mouthful.
It is, yeah. But the core idea is really important. Basically, it's looking at a limitation in how current vision language models work.
Okay, what's the problem they're trying to solve?
Well, think about how these models connect words and images. They often work with a fixed certainty. They produce a single representation, a single embedding.
Yeah.
But language and images, that they're inherently fuzzy, right? There's uncertainty.
Right. One description could match slightly different pictures, or one picture could be described in a few ways.
Exactly. And these standard models, they kind of struggle with that inherent variability, that ambiguity. So this paper, PARIC, it proposes a method for the models to actually acknowledge that uncertainty, maybe even use it.
Okay. So acknowledging the fuzziness.
Yeah.
What's the big new idea then? What's PARIC bringing to the table?
The PARIC, that's the framework they introduce. And the key thing, the real innovation, is using probabilistic embeddings.
Probabilistic embedding.
Yeah, so instead of representing, say, an image or some text as just one single point in this, high-dimensional space.
Like a pinpoint location.
Right. PARIC represents it as a probability distribution, like a small cloud or a region of possibilities, rather than a single dot.
Oh, okay. So not just one answer, but a range of likely answers.
Precisely. And this lets the model explicitly capture the uncertainty involved in linking language and vision. And, this isn't just some abstract math thing. They show it has real benefits for image classification.
Okay, so it's like getting a slightly blurry picture instead of a sharp one. But the blurriness actually tells you something useful about the range of possibilities. How does that help classify what's in the picture?
That's a good way to think about it. PARIC uses these probabilistic, slightly blurry representations to generate what they call uncertainty-aware attention maps.
Attention maps.
Yeah.
Those are the things that show where the model is looking in the image, right? Based on the language.
Exactly. But instead of just pointing deterministically, look here, PARIC's maps are probabilistic. They highlight regions, but also kind of indicate the model's confidence about why it's looking there based on that distribution of possibility.
Okay, I see.
And this guidance, which includes the uncertainty, helps a downstream image classifier focus better. It leads to, what they show is more accurate classification, more robustness, especially when the data is tricky or biased.
So the language isn't just giving directions, it's also saying, I'm pretty sure about this direction, but maybe a little less sure about that one. That does sound more nuanced.
It is, much more.
Okay, before we get deeper into PARIC itself, maybe let's take a step back, put this in context. How did we get here?
Yeah.
What's the history leading up to this idea?
Yeah, good idea. It's been quite a journey. Early image classification was mostly just about visual features, right? Learning patterns in pixels.
Like standalone image stuff.
But we live in a multimodal world. We see pictures, we read captions, descriptions. That realization led to vision language models, VLMs, and some big breakthroughs came with models like SQLIP and ALIGene.
Ah, yeah. CIP especially. We hear about that a lot.
Definitely. They were trained on enormous web-scale datasets of image-text pairs. Using contrastive learning, basically teaching the model, this text goes with this image, but not that one.
Learning by comparison.
Exactly. And then you had models like BLIP, which tried to unify different approaches like contrastive and generative learning. These models got really good at understanding the semantic link between vision and text.
So these VLMs, like CLP, were a massive step. You mentioned limitations earlier. What were they specifically that PARIC is trying to fix?
Well, as powerful as they are, they mostly rely on those deterministic embeddings we talked about. That single point representation for each image, each text snippet.
The pinpoint.
Yeah. And the PARIC authors argue pretty convincingly, I think, that this is a bottleneck, especially when things get subtle, like fine-grained classification, or when there's ambiguity. One phrase describing multiple similar things, or one image having several valid descriptions. A single vector just can't capture that richness.
Right. It forces a single interpretation onto something that might naturally have several. Like summarizing a whole book in one word. You lose a lot.
You do. And that's where probabilistic embeddings come back in. The idea is to represent that range, that distribution. Now, People have been exploring probabilistic VLMs, but training them from the ground up is computationally very expensive. Massive data sets, complex models.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So a lot of recent work, including PARIC, focuses on more efficient ways. Post hoc methods, taking a powerful pre-trained model like CLIP and sort of adding uncertainty awareness afterward.
Ah, clever. Like an upgrade module.
Kind of. Things like Bayesian techniques or what PARIC uses, probabilistic adapters. These are small add-on components that inject the uncertainty without needing to retrain the whole giant model.
Okay, that makes sense.
Anyway.
And the paper mentions another framework, GALS. Where does that fit in?
Right, GALS. That stands for Guidance for Attention Localization Using Speaking. It was an important precursor. GALS used the language understanding from VLMs to generate attention maps to guide a classifier. Focus here, not there.
So, language-guided attention.
Yes. It was about improving interpretability, making the model look at the right things based on the text. But like the VLMs it used, GALS relied on deterministic embeddings.
Okay.
So you can think of PARIC as the next logical step. It takes that core idea from GALS language guiding visual attention, but makes the guidance probabilistic, uncertainty-aware.
So GALS gave a specific map. PARIC gives a map with probabilities or confidence levels attached to different areas.
That's a great way to put it. It accounts for the fuzziness.
Okay, the context is much clearer now. PARIC builds on CLIP, builds on GLOS, but adds this crucial probabilistic layer. Let's get into the nuts and bolts then. How does PARIC actually do this?
Okay, so at the heart of it, they start with a pre-trained CLIP model, usually with a ResNet backbone, something solid. They keep CLIP frozen, mostly.
So they don't retrain CLIP itself?
Not the main encoders, no. That saves a ton of computation. Instead, they add these small, learnable modules they call probabilistic adapters. These are usually just small MLPs, multi-layer perceptrons with dropout.
Okay, little neural networks attached to CLIP.
Exactly. One for the image encoder, one for the text encoder. And the job of these adapters is to take the standard deterministic embedding from CLIP and transform it into the parameters of a probability distribution.
Ah, so the adapter learns how to describe the uncertainty around CLIP's output.
Precisely. They specifically use something called the generalized Gaussian distribution, or GGD. It's quite flexible. It has parameters for the mean, the scale, like variance, and the shape, which lets it model different kinds of uncertainty distributions.
Okay, so for any input image or text, CLIP gives an embedding, and the adapter turns that into a GGD distribution description. What next?
Right, so now you have a distribution for the image and a distribution for the text. To account for the uncertainty captured by these distributions, they don't just use the mean, they sample from them.
Sample?
Yeah.
Like draw random points from within that probability cloud.
Exactly. They sample multiple points in the paper. They use K50 samples, so you get 50 slightly different potential embeddings for the image and 50 for the text, all plausible according to the learned distributions.
50 versions of the image meaning, 50 versions of the text meaning.
Okay. Then for each pair of sampled image and text embeddings, they compute a similarity score. How well does this interpretation of the image match this interpretation of the text?
Got it.
And they use these similarity scores, along with a technique called GradCam, applied to CLIP's visual features, to generate a saliency map for each of those 50 samples.
GradCam, that's the heat map thing again, right?
Yeah.
Showing where the model's attention is focused.
Yes. So GradCam uses the gradient information flowing back into the convolutional layers to see which parts of the image were most influential for achieving that similarity score between the sampled embeddings. So you end up with 50 different heat maps, each one a slightly different perspective on where to look, influenced by that sampling process.
50 heat maps.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that definitely represents uncertainty. But how do you combine all those into one usable guide for the classifier? Seems messy.
Yeah, you need to aggregate them. They tried two main ways. The first is just simple mean aggregation. Average all 50 maps together, pixel by pixel. This gives you a kind of smoothed consensus attention map that's PARC mean.
Okay, averaging smooths things out. What's the other way?
Median aggregation. For each pixel, they take the median value across the 50 maps. The median is less sensitive to outliers, right? So if a few of the samples produced weird or extreme attention maps, the median wouldn't be pulled around as much as the mean. That's PARC median.
Ah, interesting. Mean for a smooth average. Median for robustness against weird samples. So now we have one aggregated map, either mean or median. How does that map actually guide the final image classifier?
Right, so this aggregated map serves as the reference, the probabilistic prior attention. They then train a separate image classifier, like a ResNet. The key is the loss function. They use the standard classification loss, like cross-entropy, to get the classes right.
Standard stuff.
But they add an extra term, an attention regularization loss. They call it LAT. This loss compares the attention map generated by the classifier itself, using something like GradCam again, but on the classifier's layers, with the reference probabilistic map from PARIC.
Okay, comparing the classifier's focus with PARIC's suggested focus.
Exactly. And the loss penalizes the classifier if its attention map deviates too much from the PARIC reference map, especially if the classifier pays attention to regions that PARIC, with its uncertainty awareness, deemed unimportant.
So it's like saying, classifier, try to focus where PARIC suggests, considering its uncertainty analysis.
Pretty much. It pushes the classifier to be right for the right reasons, visually grounding its decision in areas highlighted as relevant by the uncertainty-aware language guidance. The total loss is just a weighted sum of the classification loss and this attention loss.
That's actually quite elegant. You're using the probabilistic VLM's insight to regularize how the classifier learns to see. Okay, so that's the mechanism. Did it work? What did the experiments show?
Yeah, they ran quite a few experiments comparing PARIC, both mean and median versions, against that GALS baseline, and sometimes just a standard classifier. They used some challenging data sets.
Like what?
Well, the Waterbirds dataset, it's famous for having spurious correlations, land birds usually on land backgrounds, water birds on water. Models often cheat by just looking at the background.
Right, the classic bias problem.
Exactly. And PARIC, especially PARIC median, generally got better overall accuracy and, importantly, lower variance across different runs. It seemed less likely to get stuck on those background shortcuts. PARIC mean did well on specific classes sometimes, but median was more stable overall.
So the probabilistic approach helped ignore the misleading correlations.
It seems so. Then they used a subset of MS-Coco, annotated for gender based on captions, to look at implicit social biases.
Oh, interesting. Gender bias in image models is a big concern.
It is. And again, PARIC tended to outperform GALS, not just in accuracy, but also in fairness metrics, like outcome divergence, basically, how much the error rates differ between groups like man and woman. PARIC median showed the least variability in this fairness metric.
So it's potentially fairer, too. That's significant.
Yeah. And they also tested on Food 101, which can be noisy and have lots of co-occurring items. PARIC generally showed more stable performance, especially PARIC median, in reducing prediction variability for minority classes, even if GLS sometimes edged it out on raw accuracy for some specific majority classes.
So the takeaway seems to be, PARIC, by handling uncertainty, offers more robust, consistent, and sometimes fairer performance, especially when the data has known biases or noise.
That's a good summary of the quantitative results, yeah.
They also showed pictures of the attention maps, right? What did those look like? Did they visually confirm the idea?
They did, and those are often quite revealing. Generally, PARIC's attention maps looked, well, cleaner, more focused on the actual object mentioned in the text, the bird itself on Waterbirds, the person, or relevant objects in Gopo.
Less focus on distracting backgrounds compared to GLS.
Yeah, less background clutter. It visually supports the idea that the probabilistic regularization is helping the model ground the language better in the image content.
Makes sense.
But they were also honest about limitations. Sometimes, especially on Food 101 maybe, the regularization could be a bit too strong, perhaps making the model ignore some finer details. And fundamentally, PARIC is still built on CLE. If CLE doesn't grasp a concept well, PARIC can't just magically fix that. Its quality depends on the base VLM.
Right, it's guiding based on CLEP's understanding, just adding an uncertainty layer to that understanding. Okay, so let's quickly recap PARIC's core. It takes a pre-trained VLM like CLE-IO, adds probabilistic adapters to get uncertainty distributions for embeddings, samples from these, generates multiple saliency maps, aggregates them, mean or median, into an uncertainty-aware reference map, and uses that map to regularize an image classifier's attention.
Perfect summary.
And the result seems to be better accuracy in tricky situations, more robustness against bias and noise, and improved fairness.
That's the promise, and the experiments provide good evidence for it. It's a really neat way to leverage these huge pre-trained models, but address one of their key weaknesses, the deterministic view of the world. It definitely has implications for making AI more reliable in real-world messiness.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift gears slightly to our novel notions segment. Taking the core ideas from PARIC, where could this research go next? What are some interesting, maybe slightly speculative future directions?
Okay, yeah, fun part. So PARIC focused on image classification, right? But this idea of probabilistic attention guided by language seems much broader. One obvious direction is applying it to other vision language tasks.
Like what?
Well, visual question answering VQA seems like a natural fit.
Okay, how would that work? Answering questions about images.
Right. So imagine a VQA system where you ask it a question about an image. Instead of the model just internally focusing on some region and spitting out an answer, what if it generated a probabilistic attention map like PARIC's?
Showing where it looked, but with uncertainty.
Exactly. So if the question is ambiguous or the relevant object is hard to spot, the attention map might be more spread out or have lower confidence values overall. The VQA model could potentially use this uncertainty information when generating the answer. Maybe it even communicates its confidence level.
The answer is cat, but I'm only 60% sure based on this fuzzy blob in the corner. Something like that.
Sort of, yeah. Or just internally, it might hedge its bets more if the visual grounding is uncertain. It could make VQA systems feel more reliable, more trustworthy, because you get a sense of how confident the model is in what it saw to answer the question.
That could be huge for interpretability and trust, especially for complex questions or messy images. Okay, interesting first idea. What else?
Another angle is to look deeper into the probabilistic modeling itself. PARIC used the generalized Gaussian distribution, the GGD, which is pretty flexible, mean, scale, shape.
But it's still just one type of distribution.
Right. It assumes the uncertainty has a particular unimodal form. But what if the uncertainty in mapping language to vision is more complex? Maybe sometimes there isn't just one blurry region of possibilities, but several distinct competing interpretations.
Like the text could plausibly refer to this object or are that object, and both are kind of valid. Multimodal uncertainty.
Exactly that. The relationship might be inherently one-to-many in a way that a single GGD struggles to capture perfectly. So you could explore using more complex probabilistic model.
Such as?
Maybe mixture models, like a mixture of Gaussians, or even non-parametric methods, things that don't assume a fixed distribution shape at all, but rather build it up from the data.
So instead of one cloud of uncertainty, you might model several distinct clouds representing different potential interpretations.
That's the idea. It could potentially capture more nuanced or ambiguous situations better. Think about subjective judgments or really fine-grained distinctions where multiple interpretations are almost equally likely. A more flexible probabilistic model might handle that more gracefully.
That sounds computationally more intensive, perhaps, but potentially more powerful for really complex cases.
Could be, yeah. It's a trade-off. But exploring different ways to model that fundamental cross-modal uncertainty seems like a really rich area.
Definitely two compelling directions branching out from PARIC's core idea. Of course, as always in novel notions, these are speculative thoughts. Fun to think about, but the research would need to bear them out.
Absolutely, just ideas to kick around.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive on the PARIC paper, we've explored how adding probabilistic attention regularization, derived from pre-trained models like CLIP, can make language-guided image classification more robust, accurate, and potentially fairer.
Yeah, it's a clever way to tackle the inherent uncertainty in linking vision and language, leading to more reliable performance, especially on noisy or biased data.
If this has piqued your interest and you want to get into the real details, the equations, the full results, definitely check out the original paper. We'll have a link in the show notes.
Worth a read if you're in this space.
And it leaves us with the thought, doesn't it? As AI gets more capable, how important will it be for these systems not just to know things, but to know what they don't know? To understand and maybe even communicate their own uncertainty. Something to chew on until next time on Tog Tensors.